Welcome back to the deep dive. Today, we're going to dive into a really fascinating idea about identity. The idea that it's not just defined by what we are, but maybe just as importantly, by what we are not. There's this great quote from Michael J. Achero. Our identity is not only constructed out of what we call the real us, but of everything that we are not. Quote, that extraneous condition of being makes all the difference, and that thought that identity is shaped by what we aren't. It's such a powerful lens, right? Especially when we look at culture, at art, how identities form in relation, sometimes even, well, in opposition to others. So today we're taking a really critical look into the complex history of modern Nigerian art. Our deep dive uses Sylvester Okwunodu Ogbechie's a really sharp review of Chika Okeke-Agulu's book, Postcolonial Modernism, Art and Decolonization in 20th Century Nigeria. And this isn't just, a book review. It's more about getting into this lively academic debate, which actually has pretty big implications for how we understand global art history itself. Our mission, then, is to navigate these different viewpoints on what is modern African art. We want to expose some, frankly, surprising forces that shaped the story we usually hear, and maybe uncover some pioneers who've been a bit overlooked. The goal for you listening is to come away with a more nuanced view of this really rich field, maybe have a few aha moments that challenge the usual story. Okay, let's unpack this. So at the center of all this is Okeke-Agulu's book, Postcolonial Modernism. It focuses quite heavily on a group of young art students. They were called the Zaria Art Society, nicknamed the Zarianist, right, at NCST in Zaria between about 1958 and 67. And a key idea linked to them in the book is something called natural synthesis.
Right. Now, Okeke-Agulu's argument is quite specific. He basically posits that colonialism actively resisted modern art emerging in Nigeria, that instead of, nurturing it, colonialism tried to keep African artists stuck in this sort of discourse of primitivism.
Yeah.
That their art was somehow timeless, unchanging, maybe less developed. So for Okeke-Agulu, real engagement with modernism, true modernism in African art, it only properly kicks off in the post-colonial era, and it's these Zarianists who lead the charge. His book traces this narrative, contrasting early art teachers. There's Ina Onabolu, who leaned towards British traditions, and Kenneth C. Murray, who was more about promoting indigenous art knowledge. Okeke-Agulu gives the Zarianists credit for kind of advancing Onabolu's colonial modernism while critiquing Murray. He also points to the journal Black Orpheus, and the Bari artist and writers club Ulli Beier, the Austrian critic, was a big figure there as really key platforms.
Okay, so that's the influential take from Okeke-Agulu. But here's where it gets really interesting. Ogbechie, in his review, pushes back. He offers this counter-narrative, basically questioning if the Zarianists' appearance was really so sudden or unique. He seems to suggest there's a whole backstory being missed.
Exactly. And this leads to what Ogbechie calls the Pathfinder paradox.
The Pathfinder paradox. What's that exactly?
It's this idea that the real achievements of the actual pioneers, the Pathfinders, often get wrongly credited to the people who came after them, their successors. Ogbechie argues that Okeke-Agulu's book, by focusing so intently on the Zarianists, ends up, maybe unintentionally, sidelining some really crucial earlier artists. And it overlooks quite a bit of existing scholarship about them, too.
Okay, so let's revisit those two early figures you mentioned, Ina Onabolu and Kenneth C. Murray. Okeke-Agulu paints Onabolu as this radical challenger of colonial norms, right? And Murray gets labeled with this regressive, naive traditionalism tied up with colonial policy. But Ogbechie sees it differently.
Very differently. Ogbechie contends that this really misreads the historical record. If you look at Murray's archives, it tells another story entirely. He taught drawing, painting, art criticism, exposed students to all sorts of international art, but, and this is key, he insisted they needed a solid grounding in indigenous arts first. That was the foundation for any modern expression.
Ah, okay. So not regressive, but foundational.
Precisely. His work even led to museums that gave essential knowledge to later artists, including Uche Okeke, who was a key Zarianist himself. Onabolu, on the other hand, yes, he challenged ideas about African inferiority, but Ogbechie frames him more as an assimilationist.
Meaning he wanted to adopt Western styles.
Essentially, yes. He apparently described traditional Yoruba masks, things like that, as crude forms destitute of art and science. So quite a different picture emerges. It really flips that narrative.
And talking about overlooked figures, Ogbechie really emphasizes an artist he says is grossly marginalized by Okeke-Agulu, Ben Enwonwu. Why is Enwonwu so critical here?
Enwonwu is hugely significant. He was a major modern Nigerian artist, internationally celebrated, and his career took off well before the Zarianists were even active. Ogbechie argues very strongly that any proper history of post-colonial Nigerian art has to contrast the Zarianist modernism with Enwonwu's own critical positions. You can't just ignore him.
And his background was different, too.
Yeah, he actually trained in Igbo sculpture with his father. His art showed a sophistication that went way beyond his high school training with Murray. He was getting international recognition back in 1937.
1937, wow, that is much earlier.
Exactly. Long before the Zarianists. And this isn't just, academic point scoring. Understanding someone like Enwonwu gives you a much deeper sense of the roots of Nigerian modernism. It really pushes back against any simple linear timeline that suggests African modernism was just playing catch-up with the West.
Okay, so the timeline and the key players are being questioned. What about the core ideas, like this natural synthesis that Okeke-Agulu links so strongly to the Zarianists? Ogbechie says that wasn't exactly new either.
That's his point, yes. Ogbechie argues the whole idea of synthesis was actually quite central for many African modernists, and it goes back much further than the Zarianists. He traces its roots to W.E.B. Du Bois' concept of double consciousness and to Pan-African ideology generally, this whole intellectual movement trying to merge different identities. It's a much older, broader stream of thought.
So there wasn't just one version of synthesis?
Not at all. There were competing ideas. Enwonwu, for instance, he argued for taking the best from indigenous culture, which he saw as dynamic, not static, and combining it with Western techniques, Western technologies of representation, specifically for post-colonial freedom, for emancipation.
Okay, a political dimension there.
Definitely. The Zarianists, though, while they also use the idea of synthesis, Ogbechie suggests their focus was more on building post-colonial modernity using, Euro-modernist aesthetics, perhaps looking for a way into the global art world.
Interesting distinction.
And Ogbechie critiques the way Okeke-Agulu uses the framework, because, he says, it can create this artificial split between Africa and modernity, almost suggesting Africa existed outside of history until modernism arrived, which completely ignores centuries of global interaction. I mean, think about the Benin bronzes. They depicted Portuguese figures back in the 15th century. It shows how connected African art was globally long before this period.
That's a really powerful counterexample. It complicates the idea of a neat separation. So the concept of synthesis itself is under the microscope. What about how art history as a field operates today? You mentioned globalism. How does this connect?
Right. Well, globalism is, you could say, the dominant theory in art history right now.
Yeah.
The idea is to build narratives based on connections, transcultural movement, networks, how ideas travel. It challenges those older models where art history was just about separate, autonomous national traditions. And it's meant to rescue non-Western modernism from being seen as just late or derivative of Western trends.
Which sounds like a good thing, right? More inclusive.
On the surface, yes. And Ogbechie acknowledges the positive aspects. But he also sounds a warning note. He warns about a kind of neo-colonization of knowledge if this globalism relies too much on theoretical foundations that are still fundamentally Eurocentric. Meaning it risks overlooking indigenous African knowledge systems or sidelining artists who work primarily within African cultural frameworks. It might end up validating non-Western art only when it fits neatly into Euro-modernist boxes or theories.
Can you give an example?
Yeah, he mentions a 2013 exhibition at the Centre Georges Pompidou in Paris. Despite aiming for a global perspective, its catalog apparently still described modern African art as an area still awaiting a documented history.
Oof. Even in 2013.
Exactly. It sort of unconsciously reinforces that old hierarchy, the idea of first in Europe, then copied elsewhere.
It makes you think, doesn't it? How can you, when you encounter these global perspectives, how can you check if they're genuinely celebrating diverse origins or if they're subtly just putting the old center back in place?
It's a crucial question. Okay, hold on. You mentioned earlier the Austrian critic Ulli Beier, championed by Okeke-Agulu. Well, prepare for a bit of a jaw-dropper here. This next part, it really casts things in a different light.
You're right. This is quite something. So Okeke-Agulu presents Ulli Beier as maybe the single most influential figure in shaping Nigerian art right after independence. And Beier was incredibly active writer, editor of the famous Black Orpheus Journal, founder of the Mbari Club. He seems like this key cultural figure, a facilitator. But Ogbechie brings out evidence that Beier was actually channeling funds from the Congress for Cultural Freedom, the CCF.
Okay, and the CCF was?
The CCF was a front organization for the U.S. Central Intelligence Agency, the CIA.
Wow, okay. The CIA, involved in Nigerian art. Deeply involved, it seems. Ogbechie argues the CIA actively used modern art as a tool, a weapon, really, in the Cold War. The goal was to steer post-colonial cultures, not just in Nigeria but globally, away from Pan-Africanism, away from any Soviet influence, and more towards U.S.-aligned neoliberal ideas.
How did they do that?
Through funding, mainly. The CIA's propaganda efforts influenced hundreds of publications, promoting this idea of a universal modernism which conveniently aligned with Western aesthetics. CCF money funded Black Orpheus, and it supported a whole generation of African intellectuals, including, Ogbechie notes, some of the Zarianists.
And Beier himself, what was his role beyond channeling funds?
Well, according to Ogbechie, Beier actively dismissed important Pan-Africanist figures like Ben Enwonwu, calling them anachronistic colonial relics. He was pushing a particular view of modernism.
So undermining the earlier figures.
Exactly. And Enwonwu, for his part, was fiercely opposed to this kind of expatriate control over Nigerian art. He argued that Beier's influence, tied up with these Cold War agendas, was actually subverting the aims of anti-colonialism. He called it a recolonization of the African mind through these imposed Euro-modernist aesthetics.
Did he act on that belief?
He did,
Right.
very publicly. And Enwonwu actually resigned as the curator of the Nigerian pavilion for a major event in 1960, precisely because of European involvement, which he saw as problematic. It shows how strongly he felt.
So the very cultural movement we're discussing, the one presented as a break from colonialism, was potentially shaped by Cold War geopolitics and, well, covert operations. That's a lot to take in.
It really is. It's a powerful reminder, isn't it? Cultural narratives, even ones about liberation and self-definition, are rarely pure. It forces you to ask, who's funding this? What are the hidden agendas?
Absolutely. Okay, beyond the politics and the funding, Ogbechie also raises a methodological issue, a problem with how the art itself is actually being interpreted in Okeke-Agulu's book.
Yes, this is about how we analyze art versus, say, literature. The critique is that Okeke-Agulu often leans heavily on literary theory and established critical frameworks, Freudian ideas, Hegelian, Marxian, Fanon, to explain what's going on in Zarianist art. But he often attributes these quite complex theoretical understandings to artists who, as Okeke-Agulu himself sometimes acknowledges, likely weren't familiar with those specific theories.
So reading meaning into the art based on external theories.
That's Ogbechie's argument, that this approach can end up conflating art history with literary history. It makes the actual visual stuff, the form, the aesthetics, the specific historical context of the artwork itself, almost secondary to whatever theoretical meaning the interpreter can layer on top.
It risks fitting the art into pre-existing boxes, maybe.
Exactly, rather than letting the meaning emerge from the visual evidence. Ogbechie points out that Okeke-Agulu himself notes that Zarianist painting often showed artists grappling with formal lessons from European modernists, symbolists, post-impressionists, rather than necessarily reflecting a deep dive into Nigerian artistic traditions.
So there's a tension there between the artist's actual practice and the academic interpretation applied later.
A definite tension. And Ogbechie argues this approach also tends to marginalize indigenous African art when comparisons are made. It favors drawing parallels with Euro-modernist artists, like comparing Ahmed Shibrain to Hans Hartung, for instance. And by doing that, it inevitably downplays these specific African values or aesthetics that might offer a completely different and equally valid way of understanding the work.
It really makes you think, doesn't it? When you encounter art, especially from a culture that's not your own, how do you ensure you're engaging with its visual language, its context, rather than just imposing your own frameworks onto it? It's a call for maybe a more grounded, visually focused way of looking.
Wow, okay. We have covered so much ground today. From setting up Okeke-Agulu's focus on the Zarianist to diving into Ogbechie's really powerful critiques, challenging the timeline with the Pathfinder paradox, rethinking figures like Onabalu and Murray, bringing Ben Enwonwu back into the center, then digging into natural synthesis, its roots, the different interpretations, right? And looking at the bigger picture of globalism in art history, its promises and potential pitfalls.
And then, of course, that huge revelation about Ulli Beier, the CCF, the CIA influence, the Cold War shadow over everything.
It really shows this history is far from settled. There's clearly an ongoing, very lively debate about when and how modernism in Nigeria really started and developed.
So, reflecting on all this, what does it mean for your perspective, for how you think about art history, or even cultural identity more broadly? I think what stands out is that the history of modern African art, like maybe any cultural movement, is proof that these things are rarely simple or monolithic, right? They're not universally defined from the start. They're often sites of real struggle, negotiation, constant redefinition, both from within the culture and in reaction to outside forces. Maybe you can take that insight and apply it when you encounter any cultural debate today. Ask yourself, who's telling this story? Whose voice, whose agency is being centered? And what might be the unspoken influences, the hidden funding, the agendas potentially at play?
And that raises, I think, a final important question for all of us as listeners, as learners. How can we actively participate in challenging those dominant narratives? How do we help amplify diverse voices? How do we push for a more genuinely inclusive understanding of global culture, global history? Hopefully this deep dive gives you some tools or at least some new questions to ask as you continue to explore